All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin in chapter 4. So in chapter 4, what we're going to do is we're going to take the concepts of chapter 3 of the budget constraint and the indifference curves, and we're going to bring them together. And then once we have both of those, we're going to see how, say, things like changes in price and changes in income are going to affect the budget constraint, those indifference curves. And what we are going to ultimately end up doing is creating a demand curve for individuals and for consumers. So we've got a lot to cover in this chapter, but let's go ahead and get started. So first off, I want to talk about what if there was no budget constraint? What if there was absolutely no budget that you had to live by in your life? Well, what would that mean? Well, what that would mean for you is that you would consume all goods and services to the point that marginal utility equals zero. So you would consume everything that you want until you were full of it, until you receive no additional satisfaction. Remember that marginal utility means no additional satisfaction. So if you were eating apples, you would eat apples if there was absolutely no budget, no money tied to it. You would eat apples to the point that you're full. You don't want any more apples. That additional bite of apple wouldn't bring you any more satisfaction. So you basically consume until you no longer enjoyed it. And that would be for everything, whether it's eating apples, oranges, whether it's drinking coffee, whether it's drinking water, whether it's going out and going horseback riding or something like that. But the harsh reality is we don't live in a world without a budget. We do live in a world with a budget. So this budget constraint does come into play. Decisions are a process of choosing the products so that total utility is maximized. So we're going to bring that all the way back to when we talked about consumer economics, that we are attempting to maximize satisfaction. We are trying to maximize that total utility given that budget. So consumers want the absolute most enjoyment, but they cannot spend more than they earn. That whole, we maximize our budget given, or maximize our satisfaction given a budget. They want the absolute most enjoyment. So whenever you're making decisions in life, you're going to be deciding what gives you the most amount of satisfaction with what you can afford. So that's where it comes in if we're bringing the budget constraint and the indifference curves in. So, like I said, consumers attempt to maximize their utility given a limited budget. You must stay within your budget, hence the slope of the budget line. But you also attempt to maximize your utility, hence the indifference curve. So let's see it on the graph. So down here we have this graph where we bring in this consumer equilibrium. We see that this consumer equilibrium is at point A. So let's look at a couple of these points real quick. First off, let's look at point C. So at point C, we are on I1, this indifference curve. Now, are we within our budget? Yes. Can we afford point C? Yes, we technically can afford point C. There's budget left over. But what if we spent a little bit more money? What if we spent more money? We could go and actually move to point A by increasing our budget, or not increasing our budget, but increasing the amount of our budget that we spend. We could move out to point A. By moving to point A, we would actually increase our satisfaction from I1 to I2. So there's an incentive there to move from C to point A. That incentive is more satisfaction, more enjoyment. We're attempting to maximize that utility by being on that outermost indifference curve. So if we're trying to maximize our utility, why would we stop at I2? Why not consume at B, at point B? Why wouldn't we consume at point B? We can't afford it. The consumer cannot afford this point. Because we cannot afford at point B, we cannot afford to consume out here at I7. We cannot afford 7 tacos and 4 hamburgers. That's infeasible. We can't consume there. So point B is irrational, and we just can't afford that spot. So because we can't afford that spot, we are incentivized to move to a lower indifference curve. We are incentivized to move back to point A because we can't afford point B. By the same token, we can't afford point D either. And because we can't afford point D, we move, in all 3 cases, we're moving back to point A. So point A, is what we know as consumer equilibrium. It's that consumer equilibrium that's talked about right here. This consumer is maximizing their satisfaction given their budget, meeting both of those conditions of that consumer equilibrium. And it's conditional, this consumer equilibrium is conditional upon the prices of goods and income. And as we go through this chapter, you'll see how this consumer equilibrium can actually change as we change the prices of goods or the income. There's an economic incentive. I keep saying that word, but there is an incentive to move to point A. We move from C to A because, well, we get more satisfaction. D to A because we can't afford D. B to A because we can't afford B. The slope of, and also the next thing we must note is that the slope of the budget line, the slope of this budget line right here, is equal to the slope of the indifference curve at point A. We see that the budget line and the indifference curve are both equal to each other at point A. They are tangent to each other. Those are going to be some key things that as we progress, we must note that the slope of the budget line is equal and is touching and is tangent to the slope of that indifference curve. So, point A, long story short, is the point on the budget line that yields the highest total utility. The consumer equilibrium is going to be the point on the budget line that's going to yield the highest total utility. What if we were to draw a point right here? And we're going to call that point E. What do we consume there? We're on the budget line. But the bad thing about this point, point E, is that we could actually switch indifference curves and change what we buy in order to receive a higher satisfaction. So we could consume at 9 tacos and 1 hamburger, and it's going to cost us the same amount as 5 tacos and 2 hamburgers, but we receive more satisfaction off of this other point. So why would we spend all of our money to receive a lower satisfaction? So it's going to be the point on the budget line that yields the highest total utility. And throughout all this, I keep mentioning that term incentives because this is the shortest law in economics. Incentives matter. We are always going to be moving or be incentivized to do something. In this case, we're incentivized to move to point A because that's what's going to yield the highest amount of satisfaction while staying within our budget.